if they can't become a millionaire on TikTok, they at least want to feel like the work that they're doing is meaningful to the world in general, but to them as well.
There's a new workforce of younger generation and people who are coming into the space and saying money's maybe not everything, but helping me develop as an overall person and proving that you're going to invest in me is a huge step.
A lot of people, I believe, they don't see that behind closed doors, we are advocating, we are asking, having those tough conversations with our leaders as well, right? A lot of people are physically, emotionally, and mentally ready to retire, and financially, they're just not there.
All right, guys, welcome back to another episode of our brand new HR Heroes series. I've got Marcos Rodriguez with me today, and I'm really excited to dive into today's conversation because, Marcos, when we connected originally, we talked about some of the challenges in the HR space and some of the stuff that's happening out in the world on a daily basis, and some of the challenges that both employers and employees are having in navigating this new landscape, if you will. So before we start diving into today's conversation, why don't you give everybody a little bit of an intro into you, your job responsibility, and kind of where you're at in the world these days?
Yeah, for sure. So first, thanks for having me on, Keenan. It's been great to connect with you so far. I'm excited about our conversation today. And I've been in the HR space for almost a decade, solely in the education space. And so, there have been definitely a lot of times where, just reflecting on my work, on, sometimes the leadership position that we sometimes as HR professionals take on, how we can do things better, how we're impacting people's lives. And so that's really where I focus a lot of my work is uh, definitely company values, people focused approach. And so that really is something that I'm passionate about. So that's why I'm really excited to talk today. And I am right now I'm in LA-ish area. Been here my whole life. Definitely interested in exploring other parts of the world, but we're in LA for right now.
I mean, hey man, Southern California is a beautiful place to be. I know everybody else is dealing with snow right now, so you and I being in the Southwest of the United States are definitely, benefiting from all that right now.
I
So
don't envy the weather pains for sure.
that's exactly right. So as we kind of get into today's conversation, the first topic that I really want to talk about is kind of the transition that we've seen from in-person to hybrid work, right? And this new landscape that all these different organizations are trying to navigate, especially as we've come from the last couple of years. So as the landscape has changed from in-person to fully remote back into the hybrid work style, right? Employers are having a really tough time getting their employees to commit to this new 100% in-person lifestyle. And some statistics that are really interesting is in 2023, 51% of businesses offered flexible working styles. And by the end of 2023, 64% of those organizations then offered flexible working, which is a huge improvement. But there's some dichotomy in there because those organizations were then surveyed at the beginning of 2024, and they found that 38% of those businesses that were representing that 51 and 64% growth want their employees to come back into the office full time. So my question is for you, from your perspective, why do you think there's a significant of employees who prefer this flexible working arrangement, and how does that expectation for them to come back into the office full time kind of create friction between leadership and the culture of their organization?
Yeah, I think it comes down to work-life balance. Uh, Before the pandemic, and I'm going to refer to the pandemic a lot because I think it was definitely a before and after, right? But before the pandemic, a lot of companies were already exploring remote options. A lot of companies were already kind of exploring what that meant, what that looked like. But for just about everybody during the pandemic, everything was remote. The world had to keep moving, but everything was remote. And so people got a glimpse of the possibilities that exist when you have a remote work lifestyle. It's also about productivity, I think. A lot of people feel like we lose work time, right? In the commute, in the chit chat with our colleagues. If you're not doing something that's truly meaningful in person, it kind of feels like a wasted day. Uh, and so, unless employers are willing to listen and have an open mind, I think that this is going to continue to drive a wedge between employers and staff members. I think a lot of times employees feel like the leaders are out of touch, you know?
I think there's a huge understanding or a reshape in how leadership kind of approaches the new expectations of the workforce. And so, my next question for you is what type of qualities should leaders exhibit in managing the expectation of a flexible workforce? And why is that relationship and communication between their employees and the employer so important for kind of establishing a better trust equation, if you will? Because I feel like a lot of organizations today have kind of almost pulled the rug out from everybody, and that really has a huge ability to diminish trust in the organization.
Yeah, for sure. You know, I've talked to a lot of people. I've experienced this myself, where when you're looking for your next work home, uh, a lot of employers were saying we don't plan on going in the like having an office structure every day. It might be remote, but we're looking at it might be hybrid, but we're looking at fully remote eventually. And like you said earlier, that completely shifted for sometimes reasons that aren't exactly transparent or reasonable to employees, right? And so I think it starts with transparency. I know that a lot of organizations, a lot of companies, they cite productivity and honesty and ensuring that there's equality and how much effort employees are putting into their day to day. And I think those are real concerns. However, if there's an issue, address it, ask questions, be direct about it, but don't create problems that aren't there. So I think transparency definitely is a key component in that. If your workforce, if your staff are presenting certain issues from being remote or having a hybrid schedule, then address those things that you're seeing. Don't try to preemptively um, punish or you know before you even explore those options. I think leaders have to also be creative. As I was sharing before, if you're just having people come into the office just because, uh, that feels like a waste for a lot of people. And if there's in person obligations or meetings that you're expecting them to make, I think that they need to be meaningful. I feel like they need to be times where you build connections with your colleagues, where you dive really deep into the work that you're doing. Um, Sometimes operating in this area, right? Like in the planning and the looking ahead, not really into the day to day that I could have done at home anyway. Uh, Sometimes it can feel like a chore, and I think if leaders can become creative and find ways to keep folks engaged, I think that's gonna make those instances of in person work smoother.
And I think that transcends all types of organizations, both in sophistication and size. I was actually having a conversation before we hopped on here today with another HR leader, and she does contract work for Disney, which I thought was incredible. But one thing that she said was they want us to come into the office every single Wednesday for a 1 o'clock meeting. And guess what? This 1 o'clock meeting today is on Zoom. And so now from her perspective, she's speaking, she says, I have to travel in LA traffic for an hour and a half to get there, an hour and a half to get back, and it's not meaningful. And so that meaningful work, I think, is just so important. And I kind of reestablishing what meaningful work means when we come together is also important, because if you're just going to come together and have that hands-on meeting and everybody leaves again, like what's the point of that?
Yeah, absolutely.
So my
Absolutely.
next question for you is, one of the things that I kicked over to you as kind of our show notes was the terminology of flexor tirement. And I thought that was really interesting because, especially in the education space, right, we see that there's not only an influx of new people who are coming into the space, but also your legacy employees also have to find themselves working other jobs after they retire. And that's become a huge part of our culture today. And so, give us a little bit of your perspective on flex tirement, is what I was trying to say before, and kind of your perspective and how that can play in your space of education.
Yeah. So, just a little side note on there. I think, the workforce, has definitely increased in terms of size, right? But in opportunities and in desirable positions, it has not. And so in the education space specifically, there's a huge shortage of teachers. There's a huge shortage of educators who are interested in remaining in the classroom, interacting with kids on the day to day, interacting with parents. And so it's really detrimental to now see a bunch of, legacy educators retiring, and it's causing real concern. And it's driving costs in a huge way up for employers in school districts, because now we have to find credentialed employees from out of state and do relocation bonuses, or sign on for an agency where we have to hire subs and do all of that stuff. So I think that the flex retirement is a step in the right direction. I think it addresses a couple of things, right? It creates those learning opportunities for younger or newer staff members where they can learn from those seasoned employees. I think that there's a lot of sound practices that we can learn from the baby boomers, from older Gen Xers, definitely, and we don't want to lose that. We don't want to lose those opportunities, because that also creates, in my opinion, satisfaction on the younger employees end, because then they see, well, this is where I could be 10, 15, 20 years from now. It feels like this organization is investing in my growth and in my learning. And even if I don't stay here that long, I can take these learnings and go elsewhere, right? So it's addressing those pieces. But you said it earlier, just now, it also addresses, the social security and cost of living crisis. A lot of people are physically, emotionally, and mentally ready to retire, and financially they're just not there. A lot of the times, we do a poor job of educating our employees or even ourselves on what a healthy retirement fund needs to look like, when it needs to start. And I think a lot of folks didn't have that education, didn't have the ability to take care of a lot of those things. And a lot of people, I think, are now looking and saying, okay, I'm ready to retire, and how am I going to live for the next 20, 30 years?
I mean, one of the scariest things that I think about, Marcos, is somebody who's dedicated their entire life to their ability to create a lifestyle for themselves that's based on their employment. And then all of a sudden, right, you retire and you have no income that is sufficient to what you were making before, and it forces them back into the workforce. Those are some of the saddest stories when you hear, like, yeah, my dad retired at 70 years old, but now has to work at Home Depot on the side to be able to pay the bills. And I feel like this flex-tirement gives the ability for us to not only create security from a financial perspective for people who are on their way out of an organization, but more importantly, it creates those bridges towards mentorship that you were talking about as well, which could be incredibly invaluable, but also creates an ideal for what the future looks like, right? I think everybody wants to be seen, everybody wants to be heard, but more importantly, people want to be taken care of later in life by their employer, which I think is just something that we need to become more comfortable with. But flex-tirement seems like a good bridge to get there.
Yeah, I agree. I think there needs to be something to keep the broader population of the workforce engaged and feeling valued, right? I think it needs to go beyond pay, and maybe just really also focus on employee wellness. So I think we can have a whole separate conversation about all that.
Yeah. Well, let's kind of get into it from a financial wellness perspective. One of the things that really caught my eye when we were talking about how we wanted to architect this episode was compensation and how it doesn't seem to be aligning with what's happening out in the marketplace. So what I want to do is I want to kind of create a level set expectation for everybody with some stats from 2023 about how much profit was made across all sectors and how compensation is following those things. So we're going to break down overall, I would say, global profit into three different categories. The first is global giants. So we've got Fortune 500 companies amassed a colossal 41 trillion in revenue in 2023 with 2.9 trillion in profit. Now let's take that a level deeper. Sector powerhouses, technology, finance, and energy claimed 63% of 2.9 trillion in profit, and US sectors, technology was the leading sector, generating 306 billion in profit. But it doesn't seem like the employee compensation is following those record numbers of billions and trillions of dollars of profit. So let's talk about that a little bit. According to Bamboo HR's study, 2 in 5, so about 40% of salaried employees did not receive a raise last year compared to 33% of people who did in 2022. What's more interesting is that the raises that did happen in 2023 were 25% smaller, on an average of 6.2% increase compared to 4.6 in 2023, which is pretty wild. So this means profit numbers are up, but compensation and raises are down. Why do you think that's kind of like a macro trend that we're seeing out in the world?
I'm gonna get into my own personal opinion here that is a little bit controversial, I'll say, but I think it comes back to a little bit of that corporate greediness. There's the workforce is so valuable, and the workforce is creating millionaires, right? People have ideas, people establish businesses, people create working opportunities for the workforce. But without the workforce, those ideas, that company means nothing. And so there's, I want to be careful with how I'm saying, I'm presenting my ideas, but there's a very real aspect of companies continue to, in some companies, obviously not all, but continue to exploit that dynamic. And I think, I I don't work in any of those industries, and so maybe I'm not in the right industry, but I will say, um, trends like that create a very difficult situation for companies in nonprofit organizations or in the nonprofit sector, or areas that aren't booming like that, right? Because employees see those profits, that growth, and they see other workers advocating for themselves. And obviously, yeah, of course, they want to advocate for themselves in the same way, but the realities are not the same. And so I do think that there needs to be more transparency, more of an effort for these giants to level the playing field a little bit. And I think compensation for the workforce needs to reflect that those margins.
I feel like a huge part of this, and this is me getting into my personal perspective, is I think the lines between what's happening in our own world and what's happening in other people's world continues to be blurred, if you will. And so what I think about when I see those huge numbers coming from profit and technology and these other sectors, I feel like there's a natural sense of comparison that happens in life where it's like, okay, if all these companies are making money, is my organization making money like that and they're just not passing it down the tree? Like that sense of trust is a huge element. And some statistics that I pulled as well, it says nearly 29% of employees don't expect in 2024 to get a promotion. So that's a huge number. So that's almost a third of our workforce expects not to have any professional growth in their organization. But more importantly, 73% of employees said that they would consider leaving their current role for a higher paycheck. And 48 have thought about doing so in the next 6 months or in the last 6 months, which is an incredible increase from what we've seen over the last couple of years. And so do you think it's a part of that distrust, if you will, that kind of we see out in the marketplace that creates people to start looking for other opportunities to be paid more because of the social structure and all the other financial pressures that we see out there?
Absolutely. I think that's exactly what's driving that. It's that comparison and sometimes the lack of knowledge, right? And the lack of how things work in some of these areas. And both things can be true at the same time. There can be a reality in where other organizations are also not passing on those earnings to their workforce. That's true as well, but it's not just black and white. There's definitely a gray area that we need to also visit from time to time. And so I do think that a lot of times compensation isn't the end all be all. There are situations where folks will say, well, maybe I'm applying for this position and I might take a pay cut, but I'll have work life balance. I'll have these benefits that I didn't have before. I'll be closer to home. It could be a number of things, but it needs to be partnered. Like for somebody to come to that realization, the organization also needs to partner that or those benefits with a sound compensation philosophy, something that makes sense for 2024. Because it's very different than it was even in when I started working in 2008 or 9 or something, whatever it was.
I feel like, there's and this is kind of leads into a perfect segue of our next type of conversation is the role that HR plays in this fight. So if we recognize that there's a new workforce of younger generation and people who are coming into the space and saying money's maybe not everything, but helping me develop as an overall person and proving that you're going to invest in me is a huge step. So let's talk about some of the suggestions that HR professionals can use to be able to retain top talent. The first one is thinking beyond the salary. So research has made it clear that while employees were sometimes dissatisfied with their compensation rates, they were willing to sacrifice higher compensation for additional perks like flexible work and job security. Now, this can be a huge opportunity from a communication perspective to be able to have HR leaders and leaders of organizations talk about additional perks. So what do you think about thinking beyond the salary and the role of HR in that space?
Yeah, I think I said it before. It doesn't, pay isn't the end all be all. It's definitely the top, um, the top aspect that folks keep in mind, right, as they're looking for work. But I think it's also about creating meaningful connections to the work that people do. I think it goes into the benefits, into putting people in the right positions, into investing in their growth. I think, you know, I'm going to try to make a connection here, but I do think that social media has played a huge, huge part into the way that people view their work. In the age of Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, where people are making millions by posting a video, by retweeting, reposting, or dancing in front of the camera, it goes back to that comparison. Like, oh, could I do that? Is that something that I could be, getting a chunk of? And sometimes it is, but that's not the reality for everybody. And I think people, if they can't do that, if they can't become a millionaire on TikTok, they at least want to feel like the work that they're doing is meaningful to the world in general, but to them as well. And, in the words of Jim Halpert, not just push paper. Um, there's a very real component of that, in my opinion. And so it does need to be partnered with the benefits, with the pay. But I think employers have a responsibility of hiring folks for the right positions. I understand that there's a labor crisis in many different aspects, right? But sometimes when you're able to make those meaningful hires, don't just try to fill a seat. Don't just try to fill a position because you're going to find yourself having to recruit for that same position in 6 months, right? And so it's this cycle of do the right thing, and you'll see longevity in that employee's life at that in that organization.
So my next suggestion is about communication, and we kind of touched on that a couple times in today's episode. But one of the next things they talk about as the responsibility of HR is to communicate clearly and often, specifically around transparency of salary. So this is a huge step that a lot of organizations have been taking over the last couple of years, is being transparent about what everybody's being paid. Now, this kind of plays into the upper conversation of what we were talking about of these organizations are making gigantic profit. And sometimes they are not passing those dollars down into the employee pool. But also, I think what's worse than not communicating about salaries is not communicating about the financial health of the organization. So let's talk about the communication process around salaries and also around the overall financial health of an organization. What's your 2 cents on that?
I've seen it play out both ways, Keenan. And in my opinion, transparency is always the way to go. People are better equipped to make the decisions that they need to make personally and professionally when they know where they stand, right? And so if as an employer you're not making it your responsibility to keep your employees informed about the health of the company and why the compensation is set up the way that it is, that's just going to continue to further create that gap of trust because they don't know. Employees don't always take the time to read and look into things. And sometimes they shouldn't have to, as an organization, that should be your responsibility because you want to keep those folks on your payroll, on your team. I think leaders should seek feedback from staff about their compensation philosophy and make genuine efforts to find true equity in those processes. And sometimes you can't, as you know, sometimes the money is just not there. Sometimes the structure is not something, that allows for certain things. But then also be transparent about that. if you're seeking feedback, implement the feedback that you're getting or be transparent about why you're not. Because it goes back to trust. If you're just putting out all these surveys, if you're just asking all these questions, having all these meetings around these things, and there's zero change, zero meaningful change at least, you're going to end up in square one. People are going to be frustrated. People are going to be upset, and um, not trusting your intentions.
My next subject is about gathering feedback and analyzing feedback from employees. So I was doing some research the other day, and I came across a empowerment study about employees and how this is going to be a trend for 2024. And the biggest thing was 70% of Gen Z workers who are coming into the workforce believe that they can single-handedly change or impact their business based on their feedback. And if they don't get that feedback, they start going to social media where they can magnify their voice and get more people behind it. So my question for you is, why is actually taking that employee feedback and utilizing it and weaponizing it to create a better company culture and organization in general so important? And how does HR kind of play into that role?
Yeah, so I think HR is often tasked with the things that everybody else doesn't want to do. We deliver the bad news, we have the tough conversations. Uh, but what a lot of people don't see in the background is that a lot of the times we have to, as HR leaders, we have to stay informed about what's trending on social media, what people are saying, how the culture is changing. And I believe that a good HR leader is not only keeping their organization informed about these trends, but also advocating on the employee side. Because our base responsibility, in my opinion, is stay abreast of HR policy, compliance, make sure you're taking care of the company. That's our base task, in my opinion. But there's also a huge component of you also have to advocate for employees in a genuine manner. And so a lot of people, I believe, they don't see that behind closed doors we are advocating, we are asking, having those tough conversations with our leaders as well, right? But we are not the decision makers in a lot of these spaces. And so if you have an HR leader who is staying on top of these trends, listening to what's out there, and as an organization you choose to ignore it, you're doing yourself a disservice, because then you get the backlash, then you get, the cancellations, then you get the loss in customers and in revenue. I mean, there's just a downstream effect. And you obviously, people have their opinion about how social media is being weaponized, um, you know, in today's culture, and I get that, but it's still a reality that we can't escape, right? And so you shouldn't, as a leader, as an organization, I don't think that you need to wait until somebody's trying to cancel you to start listening. You should be proactively listening to these things, keeping your ear to the street about what people need. I think a lot of times, and I think this is why people think that leaders are out of touch, because I think sometimes it's easy to forget that they're not just employees, they're not just working for you. Like, this is how people find meaning in their lives. This is how they put food on the table for their families. This is literally their livelihood, right? That's what we're talking about. And so I think that's why it's really important for companies to listen to their HR leaders, the people who have their ear to the ground.
I mean, that makes sense. I think, it's interesting because social media over the last couple of years has been demonized because it's had negative impacts, right? But if you look at it as a tool that's always going to be here, I think it's advantageous for leaders today to get their ear to the ground, like you said, or ear to the streets, and be able to use these channels to gather feedback. Because I think there's an interesting perspective as well. We act differently when we're in our work environment and talking to leadership. But as soon as somebody hops on social media, they're going to let their actual feelings and all of their intentions and their true, thoughts fly. And thinking that we can't tap into those communication channels to gather more insights, I think is a huge misstep. And it's something that very transparently leadership in the future of business is going to have to become used to, because it's always going to be a channel of communication. And it's honestly more transparent and honest on those channels than everywhere else. And so we need to use those things to our advantage.
Absolutely.
So my next thing for you is benefits and a focus on mental health. So mental health has become incredibly popular over the last couple of years, which I'm incredibly enthusiastic about. But some interesting studies came out in a Lyra Health 2024 health trends survey. 94% of employees said their employer offering mental health benefits was very important to their prospective employers. But that number is almost 3 times higher than it was in 2023. So, why do you think there's such a huge emphasis on mental health these days, and why it's so important from a benefits perspective of the employee?
I think there's been a, I mean, I think you just touched on it now. There's been a huge shift in the culture around mental health, right? People didn't really talk about these things a few years ago. There was still a lot of taboo around mental health and what that meant. Um, Going back to social media, there's a lot of conversation on social media about mental health. There are things that are being talked about publicly that would have blown people's minds in the 90s and the 80s. Like, you're really saying this in public. And so that's broken a lot of the stigma around mental health. And so I think people didn't feel comfortable asking for these things as a benefit from their employer, right? Um, but today, I think many people understand the need to prioritize mental health just as much as all of the other aspects of our physical well being. And so, with an increase in demand, finding providers that are able to meet the needs of millions of people at this point, I think employees are relying on their organizations to think outside of the box and be able to connect them to mental health resources that are meeting their needs. And so I think that's going to continue to grow as people continue to uh, be self aware of their own physical and mental health needs.
I feel like, what you talked on there was a challenge that I've been seeing in the mental health space since I got here in 2014 is we now have a gigantic demand for people who are trying to talk to a trusted resource, a therapist or a counselor. But unfortunately, the demand is not meeting, or the demand is outstripping the ability for those providers to respond. So being innovative about increasing access to resources is super important. And that's actually kind of the work that we do here at FRANSiS. We have a mental wellness service that sends you one daily text of positivity, encouragement, support, or a mental wellness exercise. Because we even recognize that even sometimes when an organization allocates an app or they have a fractional counselor, somebody who comes into the facility or the office, not everybody takes advantage of that because we're so busy doing everything that we do on a daily basis. And so being innovative about the approach, about how we meet the demand of mental health support, I think is just super important. It's going to be a huge part of business as we get into the next 20, 15, 20, 10, 15, 20 years, because I don't think that these challenges are going to go away anytime soon.
No, I agree. I think that the need for this is just going to continue to increase. I mean, we've seen it in the last 5, 10 years.
So my question for you as we kind of wrap is, Marcos, this is a little bit of a personal question, but what does mental health mean to you?
Mental health, I think, is just like I said before, just as important as every other aspect of our well being. Uh, as somebody who has struggled with anxiety, you can put yourself in the shoes of other folks, that your colleagues, the people that you work with, um, and I think mental health to me personally needs to stop being looked at as like a luxury and benefits. It's not a luxury anymore. It may have been a few years ago, 10 years ago, maybe. It's not anymore. It's just as important as medical and dental and all of the other perks and retirement and, all of those other perks. It's just as important. Um, Specifically here in the US, we're constantly bombarded with tragedies that are attributed to mental health, right? If and I think if we put a little bit more importance around taking care of that aspect of our health, I my hope is that we would see some relief from the constant grief that we're experiencing collectively. And so, to me, mental health is everything. It's taking care of your heart, your emotions, and having a resource kind of to channel all those things that you're experiencing personally, but also how your work kind of forces you to acknowledge those same things.
Yeah, I feel like, we've run into a problem in society. And when you mentioned, the consistent tragedies, over last, even a couple last weeks, we've seen consistent tragedies happening from shootings at different schools. And it's just a part of our American culture, which is so heartbreaking to say. But it almost seems like there's a sense of like compassion fatigue that comes
Mm,
along with that as well, because it's like, oh, there's another one. Oh, there's
yeah.
another one. I mean, here in Las Vegas, we had a shooting at UNLV a couple months ago. And the fact that that happened so close to home hit differently. But I was talking to my girlfriend and a couple friends about it, and we were like, it's tragic to see, but it's something that we expected. And that expectation of tragedy is something that is just so terrible to see as it runs rampant through our society because it impacts us in so many different ways. It almost seems like we are willing to spend money to treat a symptom instead of the actual problem. And it's like, guys, let's refocus down to first principles and start thinking about what is actually causing this behavior, and then how can we impact that to reduce it downstream. And I think that's just so important for us to kind of think about. Well, Marcos, today has been an absolute blessing. I really appreciate you coming on the show, giving your insights, really kind of diving deeper into these compensation issues, some of the profit that these organizations are putting up, the expectation, talking about flextirement as well, which I think is really cool and an interesting concept that we're going to see more of this year. As we kind of close here, why don't you use the last couple seconds to give everybody an understanding of how they can find more information about you, your organization, and if they want to connect with you?
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned, I work in the education space, and so I work for a charter management organization called Alliance College Ready Public Schools. We have about 23 public charter schools in the LA area serving communities of higher need, with a real emphasis on the idea that all students, regardless of their zip code, can achieve a high quality college education. And so that's what we really put an emphasis on ensuring that our scholars are equipped with the necessary tools and resources to get that college education. It's so important. A lot of me personally, when I was growing up, I did not get the opportunity to go to college, even though it was a desire of mine. And so I feel like putting, again, going back to your point, addressing the real problem instead of the symptom, giving those scholars what they need to get that is really our emphasis. And so anybody who is interested in connecting with me, I am on LinkedIn, and you can find me under my name, Marcos Rodriguez, or my URL or my tag on LinkedIn is mrodriguez2591. Keenan, it's also been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I appreciate it, guys. It's been another episode of our HR Heroes series. And Marcos, thank you so much once again for joining us, guys. That's a wrap. Thanks so much.